In the last video, we saw how we could use the middle tier method and also use a connection to a SQL Server database to instantiate and to open a connection object. So here you can see I've instantiated my connection object. Here, I'm going to scroll this out a little bit. Here is my connection string setting of that connection object in a constructor in my middle tier class, which is over here in my Solution Explorer. And that is pointing to, this connection string is pointing to Configuration Manager, which points to my app config file in my application over here. I have this app config file, which is an XML file that actually contains the connection string. There we go. The connection string to my database. Now the connection string includes the data source, which is the server name, the initial catalog, which is kind of a funny name for the database itself, and then how are we authenticating ourselves to SQL Server, and that's integrated security, meaning Windows security. So if I'm logged in as administrator to my local machine, that's how it's authenticating me to SQL Server. So all of this information, this connection string, is what our application is going to need in order to communicate with Pubs 2012 here. So in my middle tier, in our last video, I set up that connection object, which by the way is a SQL client, specifically written for SQL Server, SQL client kind of connection, and then I wrote a method, my little method here, to actually open the connection, because that is a requirement before we can start speaking SQL to the database, is that this connection must be open, and I'm returning that to whatever the calling program is. And I'm throwing any kind of exception that might be thrown by SQL Server, and then just for good measure I'm catching any other kind of exception that might fall through the cracks. So I'm going to go to my form. This is just a Windows application. Once again, I'm going to view my Solution Explorer over here. So this is Form 1, and I'm looking at its design, and on it I just have three things. I have a button, I have two labels, one for connection string and one for the state of the database connection. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to the code window of my form, and I'm going to add in a couple of things here. The first thing I'm going to add in, you'll notice that I already have system.data, but I'm going to be using some of those specialized SQL Server database objects, and so I'm going to say using system.data.SQL client. And then I'm also at the top of my class here, I need to instantiate the middle tier, because in order to call that method that I wrote just a little bit ago, I have to instantiate this middle tier class. So I'm going to go ahead and do that in my code window. So that's called DB middle tier. There it is. And I'm going to call that DBMT for DB middle tier and instantiate it. So now I have all the code in there available to me. So in form load, actually I'm going to go to my design again so we can get a better look at this. I'm going to do this in my button click event. So in my button click event, let's do it that way. I'm going to have a try catch. And actually, I'm just going to copy that catch again from my finished version so I don't have to code all of that and stuff that right in there. By the way, if you have some code that you want to save because you know you're going to use it over and over again, just like this try catch, and actually I'm going to put a finally in here. And in that finally, I'm going to say scon.close. Even though I don't have that object yet, I'm going to create it. So another thing I'm going to instantiate up here at the top, SQL connection object. And I'm going to make that a SQL connection. oops, just a connection, and call it scon equals new. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to make sure that that's correct. I think it's an uppercase C. There we go. C sharp. Okay, anyway. So now in my button click event, I'm going to take this code that I use all the time, and I'm going to go over here to my toolbox and pin it for the moment, and then just drag and drop all this code over to my toolbox, and you see it's now preserved over here, so that from that point on, if I get rid of this or I have a new method, I can just drag and drop this code from the toolbox over here, and I have it forever and ever, which is a great thing. Okay, so I'm going to just call the method in the middle tier that returns an open connection. And remember, this is the open connection to our pubs database in SQL Server. So dbmt dot, and what did we call that? We called it open connection. Very clever. And it takes no data. You can see here's the prototype of that method. And it also returns a SQL connection object, you can see. So I happen to have one right here called scon. I'm going to say scon equals, and once that's done, I'm going to have scon returned as an open connection to pubs. The next thing I want to do then, just for the sake of this application, is I'm going to report the actual connection string just to prove that it's there in a label. And so LBL connection string dot text equals scon dot connection string, and I'm going to string that, and then I'm going to report the connection state, and that means whether it's open or closed in a label. Excuse me. So that's going to be LBL open dot text equals scon dot state, and I'm going to string that as well. The state, let's see what's going on. Okay, the state is just a string that's going to say open or closed and just report the current state of the connection, which is really all we want to do in this application. So I'm going to save this, and I'm actually going to I'll put a breakpoint here, and we'll run it. And hopefully I don't have any build errors, so we can run it without error. So it's going to start, it's going to start, it's going to start, and show us our form. There it is. So I'm going to click the button, and when I do that, it should stop right there. I'm going to hit F10 and step over that code. I'm going to scroll it up a little bit here so you can see that nothing, we had no issues with our method and opening the connection. And so let's just see what we get in our label. So if I put my cursor over this, there's that connection string in the text property, and the connection state is open, and we're not going to any of the error catching here, and we're going to finally and closing the connection, which is really important. Once you're finished with a connection and you're finished talking to the database, it's very important that you close that connection so that you can use it again, maybe in another form, to grab some more data from that SQL Server database. So you can see that I've got my connection string here, and I've got my connection state here, and that's working with an ADO.NET connection in the actual Windows application. So the next thing that we're going to be talking about in class will be another object called the command object. The command object works on top of this connection, and it's the thing that actually allows us to speak SQL to the database and bring back data insert, update, and delete data. So in other words, do all of our CRUD operations on the database. Okay, thanks a lot.